See, before the Industrial Revolution, which began in England around the early 18th century and then spread all over the world, there were feudal agricultural societies everywhere. Now, in feudal society, the methods of production were so primitive and backward. The bullock was used for tilling the land in India, the horse in Europe, and so on, that very little wealth could be produced by the feudal methods of production. And so very few people would be rich, hardly 1% or less than 1%, the kings and aristocrats could be rich. Others, over 95% people had to be poor. Because when the cake is so small, very few people can eat it. Now, this situation drastically changed after the Industrial Revolution, which I said began in England in the 18th century and then spread all over the world. Now, modern methods of production are so powerful and so big that enough wealth can be generated to give a good and decent life to everybody on earth. Now, nobody need be poor. Yet, despite this unique situation which has arisen in world history for the first time, the fact remains that this world is in fact divided into two worlds. This is not one world. One is the world of the developed countries, which means North America, Europe, Japan, Australia. China has also entered the ranks. And second is the world of the underdeveloped countries, which includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on. Now, our national objective must be to transform and uplift India from the ranks of the underdeveloped countries to the rank of the developed, highly industrialized countries. Because unless we do that, we remain condemned to poverty, unemployment, lack of healthcare, lack of good education, etc. So the Indian national aim must be to transform India from an underdeveloped country to a highly industrialized country. Now, the question is, how do we go about doing that? Because that is the central question which must be faced by all thinking people in India. You see, I don't think it can be achieved within the framework of the present constitution. Because under the constitution, there is parliamentary method of democracy. And you all know that parliamentary democracy in India largely runs on the basis of caste and communal vote banks. Now, casteism and communalism are feudal forces which have to be destroyed if India is to progress. But parliamentary democracy further entrenches them because it runs on the basis of caste and communalism. So obviously the answer to the question, how do we transform India from an underdeveloped to a developed country, does not lie within the framework of the Indian constitution. The answer lies outside the framework, which means some kind of French Revolution alone can achieve it. Now, how that will come, when will it come, who will be the leaders, all these things no one can predict. But because one cannot be rigid about historical forms. But this transformation has to take place. Otherwise, you remain condemned to backward and poverty. And whoever is poor is kicked around in the world. He is given no respect. Do you give respect to a beggar? You will never respect him. So, therefore, if you want respect in the world community, you have to transform India into a highly prosperous, highly industrialized country, like the Western country. And I tell you, it doesn't take more than, say, 20 years to transform India from this present condition to countries like USA. It will not take more than 20 years, because what do you require for that? You require a huge pool of technical talent. All that we have in India today. We have thousands of bright engineers. In fact, our engineers are manning Silicon Valley in California. I go there very often and meet them. In American universities, there are a large number of Indian professors in the faculties of science, engineering, mathematics, medicine, and so on. So we have a huge pool of technical talent. And second thing which is required is huge natural resources. That also we have. India is not a small country like England or Japan. It's almost a subcontinent. But see, now let me tell you what is the main hurdle in this historical transformation which we must make. And here you must listen to me very carefully. I will have to, you please be patient, I'll have to go a little deep into this matter. See, cost of labor is a big chunk of the total cost of production. And if cost of labor is less, then cost of production is less. And if cost of production is less, you can sell your goods at a cheaper price and undersell your business rival. There is competition in the market. One businessman eliminates another businessman, not with bombs or guns or tanks, but by underselling it, which means selling the same high quality good at a cheaper price. Now, this happens also on the national and international level. To give you an example, China had a revolution in 1949. After that, the Chinese leaders set up a massive industrial base in China. Now that massive industrial base, coupled with the cheap labor available in China, enables the Chinese to undersell the whole world in consumer goods. If you go to Western supermarkets, I've been there many times, they are packed with Chinese goods because the Chinese sell the same high quality good which the American manufacturer sells, but at half the price. Because Chinese labor is cheap, American labor is expensive. So if India is also transformed into a highly industrialized country, which it can be, because as I told you, we have a huge pool of technical talent and all the natural resources. Then with our cheap labor, we will undersell all the developed countries. Our labor is even cheaper than Chinese labor. So will the developed countries permit this? Will they permit the transformation of India from an underdeveloped to a highly developed country? Because if we become a highly industrialized country, then we will sell the same high quality goods which the Western manufacturers sell, but at 1/3 the price. So will their factories not close down, causing millions of people to become unemployed? See, once you set up a massive industrial base, then everything turns on the cost of labor. A country which has cheap labor has a distinct advantage over countries which have expensive labor. India has very cheap labor. So if we become a highly industrialized country, will the developed countries' economies survive? They will not be able to face the competition from us. So they will fight tooth and nail to prevent India from becoming a highly industrialized country. And how do they do that? They do it through their local agents by making Indians fight each other in the name of caste, religion, and so on, so that we keep fighting each other instead of unitedly launching a historical struggle for the transformation of India. So there's a secret unwritten rule among the developed countries that India must not be allowed to become a developed country. They will never say that. It's not written anywhere, but you can understand it by common sense, by inferences. So they will instigate Hindu-Muslim riot. For example, partition was also for the same reason, partition of India between India and Pakistan on the basis of that bogus two-nation theory. That is why it was done, so that India does not emerge as a modern industrial giant like another China. See, one China has become a headache for the West. Now, if another China emerges in the shape of India, what will be left of the Western economies? Who will buy the expensive goods? You see, their labor is very expensive, and therefore their products are very expensive. So we must realize that while on the one hand, our national aim is that we must transform India and make it into a highly industrialized country. On the other hand, the aim of the developed country is that India must not be allowed to become a developed country, because then the economies will collapse. So there's a direct conflict between our national aim and the aim of the developed countries. So you please, you must get these things very clear, so that you can understand what is going on in the world today. See, India is the most developed of the underdeveloped countries. There are so many underdeveloped countries, Arabic countries, African countries, Latin American countries. India is the most developed of the underdeveloped countries, and therefore it is potentially a developed country. It is on the brink of crashing into the ranks of the developed country. And we will not take more than 15, 20 years in doing so. But for that very reason, the developed countries know this, and they will fight tooth and nail to prevent India from becoming a highly industrialized country. So this is, I have just given you the background, and therefore the future of India is that we are going to have a lot of turbulence in the coming years. Next 10, 15 years are going to be very turbulent, because as I told you, those who are against us, the foreigners, they will make us fight each other in the name of religion, caste, and so on. So there's going to be chaotic conditions which are going to come in our country very soon, which will last for 15, 20 years. Excuse me. Hello? Hello? Yeah, yes? Just hold on. Please give me a minute.
Okay, sir.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible.
Yes. So I was telling you that all patriotic people in India must know these elementary facts. Our road ahead is not going to be easy, because there are powerful forces which will oppose transformation of India from an underdeveloped to a highly prosperous and highly industrialized country. There are very powerful international elements which will oppose this transformation. But on our part, we have to do it. Otherwise, we remain condemned to poverty and mass unemployment, mass hunger, massive lack of health care and good education, and so on. So it is going to be a long struggle, which may last for 15, 20 years. And the next 15, 20 years are going to be very turbulent for the reasons I have mentioned just now. This is how I see the future of India. I mean, the next 10, 15 years are going to be chaotic. All kinds of ups and downs will happen. There will be tremendous turmoil, and the patriotic people will have to make great sacrifices. Only then that great historical transformation can come, which will come through a historical people's struggle. That alone can transform India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for throwing light on such a very significant topic. Now, I would like to ask some questions. And the first question is that what is your take on Kashmir issue? It's been 70 years that sometimes it escalates, sometimes it de-escalates. What is the solution and where is government lacking?
The solution to the Kashmir problem is one and only one. That is reunification of India, Pakistan and Bangladesh under a secular government. That will automatically solve the Kashmir problem. Because this demand of Azadi by Kashmiris, it is all unrealistic. Firstly, no Indian government will survive if it grants it. And secondly, who are these leaders of the separatists who are demanding it? They are people who have the reactionary Islamic thinking that if they come to power, they will impose Sharia and put women in burqa and all this nonsense, which will take Kashmir back into the Middle Ages. So they are backward people, these leaders of the separatists. You see, one thing I must tell you, the test of every political system or every political activity is one and only one. And that is, does it raise the standard of living of the people? Does it give people better lives? Now, will Azadi for Kashmir give Kashmiri people better lives? If the Kashmiris can prove to me that it will give them better lives, I will support their agitation. But in my opinion, their lives will become worse. Firstly, as I said, the separatist leaders are all reactionaries, feudal-minded reactionaries who want to take Kashmir back into the Middle Ages, impose Sharia, burqa, and all this nonsense. Secondly, Kashmir has a huge handicraft industry. And the market for that industry are the towns of India. Almost in every town you go in India, you will find shops of Kashmiris. I went right up to Trivandrum in Kovalam Beach, and I found 2 or 3 shops of Kashmiris on Kovalam Beach. In any town of India you go, you will find shops of Kashmiris who bring their products from Kashmir and sell it in those shops. Now, if Kashmir is separated from India, then the handicraft industry of Kashmir will lose its market and the industries will collapse. How will they sell their goods? And therefore, lakhs of Kashmiris will become unemployed. Some people say, oh, we will create a market in Pakistan or China. And all. I said, look, creating a market takes 15, 20 years. It's not easy. The markets are already occupied by other people. You have to crash into it. It won't be easy. It's not just saying that we will have a market in Pakistan or China. It is just talking off the cuff. Your industries will collapse. Millions of Kashmiris will become unemployed. So it will do great harm to Kashmir. And again, let me tell you, Azadi is not an end in itself. It will only be a means to an end. The end has to be raising the standard of living of the people. If Azadi helps that, certainly we should help to get Azadi. But Azadi can do just the reverse. It can lower the standard of living of the people. Let me give you an example of Kashmir itself. Kashmir was independent till 1587, when the last independent Kashmiri ruler, Yusuf Shah Chak, was deposed by Mughal Emperor Akbar, who incorporated Kashmir into the Mughal Empire. After that, Kashmir was never independent. Now, by taking away independence from Kashmiris, Akbar, in fact, helped raise their standard of living of the people. Because then Kashmiris got access to the huge Mughal market in the Mughal Empire, huge market, and they could get Mughal technology and so forth. The Shalimar gardens and Nishat and all were built by Mughals. So they got the Mughal technology, they got access to the huge market of the Mughal Empire. So Kashmiris prospered by being deprived of their independence. As I said, independence is not an end in itself. It can only be a means to an end. And as regards abrogation of Article 370, many people have asked me. I said it is totally irrelevant. How does it matter whether you retain Article 370 or abrogate Article 370? Will it affect the standard of living of the people? It will not. So how does it matter? You know, this is just a gimmick, this abolition of Article 370. It is totally irrelevant. Unnecessarily, people say, some people support it, some people oppose it. But I'm saying it is irrelevant. It's just another gimmick, which will not affect the lives of the people, except, you know, they were deprived of the 4G internet and all for quite some time. Otherwise, will it abolish poverty? Whether you retain Article 370 or abolish Article 370, will it abolish poverty or unemployment in Kashmir? It will not. It is irrelevant. Yes.
Okay. Sir, as you always says that you don't believe in the democratic structure of India. So can you clarify on this thought you have on India, and what is according to you should be an ideal governance structure of a country?
You see, democracy in India means majority vote. It is voting in elections. Now most people, 90% people, when they go to vote on the basis of their caste or religion. They vote for the candidate of their caste or the political party which represents their caste or religion. Now, casteism and communalism are feudal forces. So our form of democracy, that is parliamentary democracy, in fact harms the Indian people because it further promotes casteism and communalism. So again, I said, the test of every system is one and only one. Does it help raise the standard of living of the people? Democracy is not an end in itself. It can at best be a means to an end. The end has to be raising the standard of living of the people. But our form of democracy promotes casteism and communalism, which are feudal forces which must be destroyed if India has to progress. So how will it help? See, I'm not too much in favor of democracy, because democracy means majority vote, and majority in India are casteist and communal, 80–90% people. So would you like to be ruled by these people? Or the netas who represent these people, who manipulate caste and communal vote banks and incite hatred of caste and religion? I'm not in favor of democracy. You have to have some kind of dictatorship of modern-minded people, patriotic, selfless people, like, for example, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk of Turkey. He was an army general. He was not elected. He staged a coup d'etat against the Sultan of Turkey. And he came to power and he modernized Turkey. He abolished burqa, sharia, madrasa. He suppressed the Maulanas and everything. He modernized Turkey. Similarly, in Japan, after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the leaders who came to power, they were advisors of Emperor Meiji. And they modernized Japan by getting in engineers from Western countries, setting up technical institutes, industries, and so on. They were not democratically elected. So you have to have a handful of modern-minded, patriotic people who are determined to rapidly industrialize the country. That is the form of government. Now, I can't tell you what will be the details of this kind of government. There may be many types, but it must be a handful of modern-minded, secular, genuinely patriotic, genuinely unselfish people who are bent on rapidly industrializing India. Because our solution to our problems is rapid industrialization. We must transform India to a highly industrialized country. Otherwise, we remain condemned to poverty and backwardness and so on. Yes.
Okay. Sir, as many scholars and international NGOs like Amnesty International says that the abolishment of death penalties is the sign of progressive society. But at many stances, you favor death penalty, like on combating honor killings and corruption. Is it the only solution to combat these problems?
Listen, ordinarily, I am against death penalty But in certain situations, death penalty should be given. As I told you, you must see this in the context of the historical facts in India. We are in a transitional period of our history, transition from feudal society to a modern industrial society. Now, whatever helps in this transition should be promoted. Now, death penalty to feudal-minded people, for example, people who do dowry deaths or who do honor killing, I absolutely approve. In fact, I've said that is the only punishment which mandatorily must be given. We have to crush feudalism. So for crushing feudalism, you will have to be harsh also. You can't be very goody-goody. These feudal-minded people, you cannot be lenient with them. You have to be tough with them. Sometimes you have to use tough measures against in the fight against feudalism, backwardness. So sometimes death penalty should be given, though that should be in exceptional cases. Yes.
Okay. Sir, recently you sparked another controversy as you have spoken in the favor of Nirav Modi, a person who was involved in a fraud of rupees.
No, I would not like to speak on that topic. Please, I will not speak on that topic.
Okay, okay. Sir, I would like to take next question, and it's a very direct question, and it is what shaped your thought on Gandhiji that you call him father of our nation, a British agent?
Listen, you must know the correct facts. Gandhiji was a lawyer in South Africa for 20 years. And then he came to India in 1915. And he was assassinated in 1948, as you know. Throughout this period, if you read his speeches, his articles, you will find them in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, which is a Government of India publication in several volumes. What does Gandhi say? He, in his public meetings, he advocates Ram Raj, cow protection, Varnashram. He was a strong supporter of the caste system. Brahmacharya. In public meetings. You know, if you are a sadhu in an ashram, you can say anything you like. But once you enter politics, and in public meetings, you are injecting religion into politics, what will be the consequence? You are dividing people on religious lines, so you are furthering the British policy of divide and rule. If you keep preaching these ideas and in public meetings, then what effect will it have on the mind of a conservative Muslim? Will he remain in such an organization whose leader is preaching cow protection, caste system, Ram Raj? No, he will go towards the communal organization like the Muslim League. And that is what happened. So was Gandhi not promoting the divide and rule policy of the British? See, the point is you people have not read all this. Many people say, oh sir, in 1947 or 48, he went to Noah Khali to propagate Hindu-Muslim unity. I said that was in 1947-48. First, you set your house, the house on fire. And when the flames are leaping up, जब आग भड़बड़ा के जल रही है, तब तुम नाटक कर रहे हो, पानी छिड़क रहे हो. तुमने पहले आग क्यों लगाई घर में? Throughout, you see his speeches and articles, you see, you haven't read all this. In almost every speech, and you go on my blog, Satyam Bruyat, there are over 12 articles on Satyam Bruyat. For example, one of them is Gandhi and caste, another is Gandhi and cow protection. I have quoted Gandhi, at least 20 quotations, where he's strongly supporting the caste system, strongly supporting cow protection, propagating Ram Raj. In his public meetings, they would begin with the song Raghupati Raghav Raja Ram. In fact, at that time, in 1915 to 1922 or so, Jinnah was patriotic and secular. And he said, Mr. Gandhi, what are you doing? Why are you injecting religion into politics? India is a country with great diversity. And at that time, before 1947, the percentage of Muslims in India was more. Now many of them have gone to Pakistan and Bangladesh. So Jinnah strongly objected, but because Gandhi's thinking was perhaps that at that time Congress was only a party of intellectuals. It did not have mass support. So perhaps what he thought was that by invoking religion, we can get mass support. And mass support did come, but it was mass support of Hindus. You read that book by H.M. Shirvai, the famous Advocate General of Bombay, called Partition of India, Myth and Reality. I think that is the name. In which Shirvai has written that Gandhi's ideas directly led to partition. You are propagating Hindu communal ideas day in and day out. Are you not acting as a British agent, furthering their divide and rule policy? Then secondly, at that time, in early 20th century, a very good revolutionary struggle had begun under Bhagat Singh and Chandrasekhar Azad and Surya Sen and so on. It was just at a very early stage, not at a developed stage, but it would have developed into a good movement, an armed struggle. Because a real independence struggle is always an armed struggle. Nobody gives up his empire peacefully. Do you think the British gave up their American empire peacefully? No, the Americans had to fight from 1775 to 1781. They launched the American War of Independence under George Washington and his Continental Army. So the Americans had to fight the British with guns, not by satyagraha or salt march or going on hunger strike or offering them bouquets of flowers. Do you think the British left India just because Gandhi used to go on hunger strike? Every genuine independence struggle is an armed struggle, because no ruler gives up his empire without a fight. So the armed struggle had begun under Bhagat Singh and Chandrasekhar Azad and Surya Sen, and it would have developed into a very powerful struggle. Of course, there would have been a lot of casualties, but in every great struggle, there are casualties. But Gandhi diverted that genuine independence struggle from the line of armed struggle to this nonsense called satyagraha and hunger strike, all this. He successfully diverted the genuine independence struggle to this farcical struggle called satyagraha and hunger strike and salt march and all this nonsense gimmicks. Many people say, but Gandhi gave us independence. Actually, independence of 1947 has nothing to do with Gandhi. It was because in the Second World War, the Germans attacked the British and made British very weak. Possibly the Germans would have conquered Britain, but had not Americans give help to the British. But Americans gave help at a price. The Americans said to the Britishers, yes, we will give you arms and other help, but then you have to open up the Indian market. Till now, you have monopolized it alone. You are looting India alone. Now we have to also share in this, the raw materials and the market of India. So 1947 was just opening up of India for investment by other countries, and so that Britain alone should not be able to monopolize India. It has nothing to do with Gandhi. It was because of the Second World War and then the Americans' pressure on the British. That is what caused the independence.
Yes. And so what are your views on Subhash Chandra Bose? Was his armed insurrection was correct against the British government? See, Subhash Chandra Bose was nothing but a Japanese agent. I have written an article on my blog, Satyam Bruyat. Initially, he was an upright man, a young man. He left the IAS, he wanted to serve the country, he was patriotic. That is true. Later on, it seems he became very ambitious. And particularly after he was removed from the presidentship of Congress by Gandhi, I think in the Haripura Congress of 1938, he became very frustrated. First, he went to Germany and he hobnobbed with Hitler and Himmler, those big criminals, wanting to get help from them. When that did not work out, he went to the Japanese and took the, because Japanese had invaded the subcontinent
So he raised this army called Hindustan Azad Hind Fauj. All this was, see, he was being used by the Japanese, because if Japanese had conquered India, do you think they would have given freedom to India? No, they would have made India a Japanese colony, because you see, Japanese economy was growing and they needed more markets and raw materials for the industry. And that is why they went right up to Asia, up to Burma. So they were fascists and imperialists, and they were just using Subhash Chandra Bose. In fact, once the Japanese collapsed, Bose also collapsed. There was nothing in the man. If there was anything in him after the Japanese surrender, he should have started a guerrilla war against the British, like the Chinese fought. In guerrilla war, you fight with the weapons of the enemy. You first snatch weapons from the enemy and then you fight with them. Why did he not do that? No, there was nothing in the man. He was just being used by the Japanese, and unnecessarily people are calling him Netaji and made him a hero. What can we do? Just a minute. I've explained all this in my article on Subhash Chandra Bose on my blog Satyam Bruyat. You can see I've written articles on Bose and also on Tagore. Both Tagore I regard as a British agent, and I've given my reasons in my article. You can see that. Tagore diverted literature from the revolutionary direction on which Sharat Chand Chattopadhyay was taking it. Sharat Chand and Qazi Nazrul Islam.
But sir,
and British got scared of it, and therefore they brought this fellow Tagore, who diverted literature towards mysticism and spiritualism, which is all nonsense in a poor country. What does a poor man have to do with spiritualism and mysticism? He wants food and a job, or does he want to see God? It's all nonsense. Yes.
But sir, Rabindranath Tagore reverted his knighthood title. Wasn't that something patriotism?
That was just a drama. That was just, listen, don't go by that. See the bulk of his writings. I don't know, you people have not read his writing. The bulk of his writing, for example, Gitanjali, or his poem Klanti, or Ogni Bina Bajao, it is nothing but spiritual nonsense, spiritualism and mysticism. That's the bulk of his writing. So he was being used by the British. Actually, there was a Britisher called Yeats who promoted Tagore and got him the Nobel Prize. Though later Yeats himself said that Tagore writes sentimental nonsense. But at that time, Sharat Chand Chattopadhyay, I don't know whether you people have read the stories and novels of Sharat Chand Chattopadhyay. I would suggest all of you read it. He wrote many very great novels. One of the novels is called Pather Dabi, Path Ke Davedar, which talks of a revolutionary organization in Bengal. And the Britishers banned that novel. And it was said at one time that the price of one copy of Pather Dabi is the same as the price of a Mauser pistol. It was so expensive getting one copy. So Sharat Chand was the great, I regard him the greatest prose writer in the Indian subcontinent, Sharat Chand Chattopadhyay. Please read all his novels and stories. And he was taking literature in the realistic direction, revolutionary direction. And the British got scared of that. So they brought in this fellow Tagore, promoted him, got him the Nobel Prize, and he diverted literature from the correct direction in which Sharat Chand Chattopadhyay was taking it towards all this nonsense of spiritualism and mysticism. You read Gitanjali, his book for which he got the Nobel Prize. What is it? It is all nonsense, all talking and spiritualism and mysticism. I mean, in a poor country, people want jobs, people want food, people want medicines, or do they want spiritualism and mysticism? It is all humbug, the spiritualism and mysticism, particularly in a poor country. Yes.
Sir, do you think that it's a time our government to take strong and decision to measure to tackle the issue of overpopulation. Do you think it is an issue to worry about at this moment?
Listen, the population problem has one and only one solution, and that is to raise the standard of living of the people. If you raise the standard of living of the people, automatically the population increase will stop. Because even today, people of the middle class, they have 1 or 2 children because you can't afford more. Because a lot of money has to be spent on each child for his education, for his clothes, for his milk, for so many things. Even the school fees has risen so much. So it is very expensive to raise a child. Earlier, things were cheap, but now situation has become very different. There's so much price rise. But so far as the poor people are concerned, their children start earning at a very young age. From 5 or 6 or 7, they're doing some small work and earning some money. So they want more children. If you want the population growth to stop, only way is to raise the standard of living of the people and give people decent life. Then automatically they will have just 1 or 2 children, because they will invest a lot on each child, and that requires a lot of money. Yes.
Okay, sir. Next question is, sir, according to the data of NCRB and various private agencies too, more than 1/3 of our parliamentarians have criminal records. You were also a Supreme Court judge of India. Why the judiciary of India allowing them to sit in the parliament?
No, see, I don't want to comment on that.
Okay, sir.
See, judiciary can only take up cases when there are a case comes in court and there's evidence beyond reasonable doubt and all, which is very difficult to prove. So there are so many things I don't want to go into this.
Okay, sir. And what is the reason of very late judicial action in our country, as there are cases pending from more than 30 years and so on?
See, let me explain this to you. Many people say that you judges delay deciding cases a lot, but they don't know the facts. Let me give you the facts. When I was a judge of Allahabad High Court from 1991 to 2004, one judge of the subordinate judiciary means from Munsif up to district judge level, below the High Court. He was CGM Kanpur Nagar. He came to meet me. And I asked him, how many cases are there pending in your court alone? He said 30,000 in his court alone. Now, Allahabad High Court had made a norm that no judge of the subordinate judiciary should have more than 300 cases pending before him at one time. But here was a judge who had 30,000, 100 times more than the norm. Another subordinate judiciary judge, CGM Ghaziabad, came to meet me when I was judge of Allahabad High Court. And I asked him the same question. He said he had 21,000 cases pending in his court alone. Few years back, I think 2 or 3 years back, I went to Bulandshahr. I'd been invited to some function. So CGM Bulandshahr came to meet me. That's in Western UP. And I asked him, how many cases are there pending in your court alone? He said 25,000. Now see, if the maximum load can be 300 and you put 25,000 cases in a judge's court, what can he do except give date after date? If a man can lift 100 pounds of weight and you put an elephant on his head, what will he do? He will collapse. So the same thing happened. Our judiciary can't handle so many cases. It's not meant to be handling so many cases. So you see, in America, 93% cases are diverted by the courts to mediation and conciliation and so on. 93%. Hardly 7% are decided by the court. But here, our alternate dispute mechanisms are very, very weak. So the whole burden comes on the judiciary, and the burden is too much. What is, even assuming a judge is honest and quick, but how much load can he carry? The load is impossible. After all, it takes time to decide a case. You can't decide a case in 1 minute. You have to first read the pleadings of the parties. Then you have to have evidence cross-examination. Then you have to have arguments of both the lawyers. Then you have to apply your mind to the case. Then only a high quality judgment can come. It can't come in 1 minute. A judge is not like a Superman who can decide in 1 minute everything. It takes time. And when there's so much load it's impossible to carry. So this is principal reason. There may be other reasons also, but this is the principal reason. There's too much load on the judiciary. Yes.
Okay. Sir, do you think that the freedom of judiciary of India is under threat?
No, I don't want to comment on that. Leave that.
Okay. Sir, as you have been a critic of the Constitution of India, what reformation it needs according to you?
No, I have written an article. If you go on the website, theweek.in, it was published there, called Why Celebrate Republic Day when the Constitution has become a scarecrow? Why celebrate Republic Day when the Constitution has become a scarecrow? You please read it. All the answers you will get in that article. The Constitution has collapsed. It's an empty shell now. State institutions have become empty shells. On the other hand, people's discontent is rising. So some kind of revolution is coming in the country, but it will take another 10, 15 years. It won't happen immediately.
Okay. Okay, sir, what is your take on the current unemployment status of our country and what it would be after COVID?
Now, let me give me a little time to give my answer. See, the solution to the unemployment problem is rapid industrialization, because then only millions of jobs are created. But the problem in the present setup, I'm talking of the present, is this, that how will you sell the goods which you produce? See, it is very easy to increase production. We have got engineers, we have got raw materials. You can step up steel production or aluminium production or motor car production. But people are too poor to buy. How the goods will not be sold, even if you manufacture them. So the problem is not how to raise the production. The problem is how to raise the purchasing power of the masses so that the goods which are produced are sold. This is the central question. Now, in the Soviet Union, the real massive industrialization started from 1928, when the first 5-year plan came. Of course, they had a revolution in 1917, but thereafter there was turmoil, civil war, and so on. And NEP came. Real industrialization started from 1928. Now, broadly, the methodology adopted by the Soviet rulers was this, that every 2 years or so, they would reduce prices of commodities by 5 to 10%. Every 2 years or so. And sometimes they would raise wages also by 5 to 10%. Now, even with the same nominal wage, when the prices are becoming less, then your real wage is increasing, because wage is relative to the price index. Now, regularly, every 2 years, see, the government used to fix prices. Every 2 years, they would reduce prices by 5 to 10. So even with the same wage, now the worker can buy more goods because goods are becoming cheaper. So this way, by state action, the domestic market was expanded steadily. And simultaneously, when industrialization was stepped up, then the goods could be sold in the domestic market, because now people had the purchasing power because goods were becoming cheaper. See, broadly, this was the methodology followed by the Soviet Union from 1928, because of which their production grew by 18% year after year. very rapid industrialization, and Russia was transformed from a feudal country to an industrialized country by raising the purchasing power of the people. Of course, that was a communist government, but even in capitalist country like America, let me tell you, there also the purchasing power of the people was increased. Henry Ford, who was the producer of the Ford car, I think you can check up on Google, I think in 1914 or 1916, he increased wages of his workers by 4 or 5 times overnight. Some people had thought he'd go mad and the company will collapse because it will not be able to carry the financial burden of the huge increase of wages by 4 to 5 times. Of course, he did it not so much due to philanthropy, but because he wanted to hold on to his labor force. You see, because this method of production, assembly line production, which he had introduced, that was so monotonous that many workers were deserting from his factories, and he wanted to hold on to his workforce. So he raised wages 4 to 5 times so that the workers would remain in his factory. That was a real motive. But once he raised it by 4 to 5 times, he gave the lead, and all other industries in America had also to increase wages. So this was raising purchasing power of the people by private enterprise. In Russia, it had been by the state. So whether you do it by state action or by private enterprise, but you have to raise the purchasing power of the masses if you want to increase production. Because otherwise you can increase production, but the goods will not be sold. So the central question is not how to increase production. Now India has got a huge pool of technical talent. This was not so in 1947. In 1947, we had very few engineers, very few industries, because the British policy was broadly to keep us feudal and backward so that we may not become a big rival to British industry. So the British did not permit us heavy industries and so on. They permitted only some light industries like textiles and plantations. But after 1947, a limited degree of industrialization did take place in India. Steel mills were set up and so on. Now we are not a developed industrialized country, but semi-developed. So we have a huge pool of technical talent, and we can rapidly convert India into a highly industrialized country and thereby abolish poverty, unemployment, and hunger, and lack of healthcare and so on. But for the reasons which I mentioned earlier, it will not be easy for us to do so. But that is what we have to do if we are genuinely patriotic. Yes.
Okay. Sir, I want to ask the last question of this session, and it is very important that how do you think the feudal structure of caste and class in India can be destroyed, in the sense that it is still prevalent in our political system?
If you read my article, What is Caste, on my blog, Satyam Bruyat, you will get the answer. But let me tell you in brief. See, caste had developed into the feudal division of labor of society. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that in feudal society, of course, most people are farmers, but there's a small section of people engaged in industry. Of course, it is handicraft industry, not mill industry. There's a small handicraft industry also in feudal society. And in every vocation, every industrial vocation in feudal society became a caste. For example, Lohar became a caste. Bahai, carpenter became a caste. Chamar, chamde ka jo kaam karta, became a caste. Or Kumhar, potter, became a caste. So every vocation became a caste in India. This happened in England also. In England, even today, many people have the surnames baker, butcher, gardener, potter, tailor, smith, blacksmith, goldsmith, mason. What does it indicate? It indicates that the ancestors belong to these vocations. And in feudal society, you had no option of changing your vocation. You had to follow your father's vocation. Because the only way to learn a craft was to sit from childhood with your father. If your father was a carpenter, you sit with him from childhood, see how he works, learn from him. He will teach you also, and you also become a carpenter. So you had to follow your father's profession. But now, situation is very changed. Now a boy, say of the Badhai caste, comes from a village to a city. He does not become a Badhai. He becomes a motor mechanic or Bijli Mistri, electrician. He does not follow his father's traditional caste. So caste system has actually been broken in reality, socially, because people are not following their caste profession. But because our political system is such that it's keeping up this caste system propped up, because it runs on the basis of caste and religious vote banks. So artificially, the caste system is being kept alive. In fact, it has largely been destroyed by the advance of modern technology. People are not following their father's caste. अब चमार का जो बेटा को चमड़े का काम थोड़ी करता है, जो चमार कास्ट का लड़का है क्या वो चमड़े का काम करेगा, या बढ़ई से कारपेंटर बनेगा, कुम्हार पॉटर बनेगा, नाई क्या बार्बर बनेगा. In fact, they are becoming motor mechanic, बिजली मिस्त्री, and so on. कई तो पढ़ लिख के इंजीनियर हो जाते हैं, लॉयर हो जाते हैं, डॉक्टर हो जाते हैं. So largely caste system has been smashed with the advance of technology, but it is being kept artificially alive by the politicians for their vote banks. तो ये खत्म हो जाएगा एक 10-15 साल में. I think caste system is destroyed. It has largely in reality been smashed in the sense which I have told you. Nobody is following his father's vocation. Yes.
Okay. Sir, with this question, we have come to an end of our event. I really hope that each and every attendee enjoyed the event and have learned so many things. Sir, it was such a breathtaking talk by you and was truly a cognizant session. So, honorable dignitaries, my extremely dedicated sir, team, I am Shiva Pamar on behalf of Nishtha Society feels immense pleasure to take this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks to our eminent speaker, Justice Markandeya Karzoo sir, to spare the time from his schedule to grace the occasion with his kind presence. I take this opportunity especially express my regards and gratitude to our principal, Dr. Rama ma'am, for confiding us to organize the event. My deep sense of appreciation and thanks to all the participants who chose to live us and attending the event with undescribable enthusiasm and made it a very successful session. Last but not the least, a very big thanks again to Justice Markandeya Karzoo sir for encouraging us and enlightening us. We really hope, sir, that you will always keep us this way. With this note, I want to inform the closure of this wonderful session. Thank you, Karzoo sir, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
हाँ जी मेरा हो गया सेशन। आरती अच्छी रिकॉर्डिंग बंद कर दे यार।